ESG is everywhere, in procurement decisions, supplier contracts, and sustainability reports. But ESG often fails, not because of a lack of intention, but because the language is misunderstood. In this video, we decode high-impact ESG vocabulary from a global commercial strategy perspective, focused on procurement and supply. No buzzwords. No slogans. Only meaning, relevance, and risk. Scope 3 emissions refer to indirect greenhouse gas emissions across an organization's entire value chain. They arise beyond direct operations, upstream from suppliers and upstream business partners, and downstream from distributors, customers, and end users. This includes emissions from purchased goods and services, transport and logistics, product use, and end-of-life treatment. For most organizations, Scope 3 represents the largest share of total emissions. This is why procurement cannot ignore it. Supplier selection, sourcing strategies, and the management of commercial partnerships directly shape Scope 3 emissions. A common mistake is treating Scope 3 as outside organizational control. In reality, it is influenced every day by procurement decisions across the extended value chain. A carbon footprint measures the total amount of greenhouse gases generated by an activity, organization, or product. It includes emissions from direct operations, energy use, and supply chain activities. Carbon footprints are usually expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e, to allow comparison across different greenhouse gases. For procurement, carbon footprinting provides visibility. It reveals where emissions occur across suppliers, transport, manufacturing, and product use. A common mistake is viewing carbon footprint as only an environmental metric. In reality, it is a strategic input for sourcing decisions, supplier evaluation, and contract design. Greenwashing refers to misleading or exaggerated claims about environmental performance. It occurs when organizations present products, suppliers, or strategies as more sustainable than the evidence supports. In procurement, greenwashing often enters through supplier claims, marketing materials, or unverified sustainability statements. The risk is not only reputational. Greenwashing creates commercial risk, compliance risk, and contract risk. A common mistake is assuming that sustainability claims are credible because they are widely repeated. In reality, greenwashing thrives where measurement is weak and verification is absent. This is why procurement must test claims, demand evidence, and link sustainability to measurable performance. Life cycle assessment, or LCA, is a method used to measure environmental impacts across the entire life of a product. It looks beyond production alone. LCA examines impacts from raw material extraction, manufacturing and processing, transport and distribution, product use, and end-of-life treatment. For procurement, life cycle assessment changes how value is understood. It reveals hidden emissions, costs, and risks that are not visible in purchase price alone. A common mistake is using LCA only as a technical or reporting tool. In reality, LCA is a strategic input for sourcing decisions, supplier selection, and long-term commercial planning. Science-based targets are emission reduction targets aligned with climate science. They are designed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement. Unlike generic sustainability goals, science-based targets follow a defined methodology and are independently validated, most commonly by the Science Based Targets Initiative. For procurement, science-based targets translate ambition into operational reality. They require suppliers, partners, and sourcing decisions to align with a clear decarbonization pathway. A common mistake is announcing long-term net zero goals without short-term action plans. In reality, credible targets depend on near-term milestones, measurable progress, and supply chain engagement. Zero versus carbon neutral. Net zero and carbon neutral are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same. Net zero focuses on actual emission reductions. Emissions are reduced as close to zero as possible across operations and the supply chain. Only residual emissions are addressed through removals or offsets. Carbon neutral, by contrast, focuses on balancing emissions. Emissions may continue but are offset through carbon credits or compensation mechanisms. For procurement, this distinction is critical. Net zero requires suppliers, contracts, and sourcing strategies to support real decarbonization. Carbon neutrality can be achieved without changing underlying purchasing decisions. A common mistake is treating carbon neutrality as equivalent to net zero. In reality, credible sustainability strategies prioritize reduction first, and offsets only as a last step. Supplier ESG due diligence. Supplier ESG due diligence is the process of systematically assessing environmental risks and performance across the supply base. It goes beyond policy statements and self-declared commitments. Due diligence examines actual environmental impacts, supply chain risks, and compliance with standards through evidence, audits, and assessments. For procurement, supplier ESG due diligence is a core risk management activity. It helps identify high-risk suppliers, prevent reputational damage, and avoid exposure to regulatory and contractual failure. A common mistake is relying solely on questionnaires or supplier assurances. In reality, effective due diligence requires verification, ongoing monitoring, and integration into supplier selection and contract management. To make due diligence credible, organizations must rely on reliable data, reporting, and independent assurance. ESG data, reporting and assurance. ESG data is the foundation of credible environmental performance. It refers to the information used to measure, track, and manage emissions and resource impacts across the value chain. Reporting transforms this data into disclosures, metrics, and sustainability statements used by management, investors, and regulators. But reporting alone is not enough. For procurement, data quality is critical. Weak or inconsistent data leads to poor sourcing decisions, misleading claims, and exposure to greenwashing risk. Assurance adds credibility. It involves independent verification or audit to confirm that ESG data is accurate, consistent, and reliable. In practice, credible ESG performance depends on robust data systems, supplier transparency, and independent assurance. Environmental ESG, the procurement role. Environmental ESG does not succeed through policies alone. It succeeds through decisions. Procurement sits at the center of environmental impact. Every sourcing choice, every supplier relationship, and every contract shapes environmental outcomes across the value chain. Procurement translates strategy into action. It turns emissions targets into supplier requirements, data into decision-making, and sustainability commitments into commercial reality. A common mistake is treating environmental ESG as a reporting exercise. In reality, it is a commercial discipline. Environmental ESG is delivered where procurement decisions are made. ESG vocabulary shapes how organizations think. But procurement determines what actually happens. In this first part, we examined the environmental language that defines emissions, measurement, credibility, and risk. Environmental ESG is not delivered by reports. It is delivered through commercial decisions. In the next part, we turn to social ESG, the human dimension of supply chains and global procurement strategy. Continue with part 2.